Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Naomi Kleitman back to the Miami Project, where she began a long time ago. Naomi trained at Washington University with Richard and Mary Bunge, came to the Miami Project in 1989, working on Schwann cell bridges. Okay, and then about 2 or 3 years after leaving or staying in the wet lab, she became the second scientific liaison for the Miami Project. So she was our voice to the community to explain science, to explain what we were doing, to explain our mission. She stayed in that position until 2001 when she went to the National Institutes of Health to be the program director at NINDS, overseeing the portfolio of spinal cord injury for both functional restoration and CNS repair. Stayed at NIH until 2012 and then went to the Craig H. Nielsen Foundation, the largest spinal cord injury foundation in the world, where she is now vice president for research and grants and oversees their entire portfolio and also provides them strategic guidance on the work that they're doing. We have a long history, and it's a real joy to see you and see the people who knew you then and some of the younger faces who should know you. So if you're doing spinal cord injury basic science, you know Naomi, or you better should. So it's a pleasure. Welcome. Thank you, Naomi.
I'll say it now and I'll say it again. What an honor and what a freaky situation and weirdness this is to be here. So thank you for the invitation to come back. It's really odd to be in a room that you remember building. It's just, there's something strange about it. And all the people in the new rehab hospital will have that experience as well. So thank you for the invitation. I named the talk Keeping an Eye on SCI because that's kind of what I do now. I'm not going to pretend to be able to talk science to you. I listen to science from you. And I don't have to do much in my first slide because Mark just did it. Who am I and how did I get here? I don't presume that everybody knows me. Nobody ever knows exactly the path that their colleagues or even their teachers have gone. So it's always a little bit good to hear about that, and hopefully will inform you about your own. But being here as, I was actually the second director of education, but first scientific liaison. Susan Fitzpatrick was the first director of education, which is really seen as a development kind of a adjunct. But becoming scientific liaison and really focusing on talking about all the science for everyone was a new thing and not something that I can't think of another kind of center that did it. Miami really pioneered in that, but it also gave me a lot of experience with media and administration. And then as you just heard, I'll talk a little bit about my NIH experiences and my Nielsen Foundation experiences. The last, I will point out one thing here, which is all of this boils down to working to see real results for real people with spinal cord injury. So hopefully that will be throughout the talk. So what did Miami give me? An incredible broad exposure. I never imagined I'd be doing spinal cord research before Dick and Mary decided to come here. And most importantly, this is one of the first lab pictures that we took. And I think I'll get a chance to see Rob in a few minutes after the talk. But I was a cell biologist and we all came down here to grow Schwann cells. But meeting the people with the spinal cord injuries informed us from the very beginning. I remember having a conversation when we first came with one of my colleagues. It's like, I don't want to be in the lab and people roll by and expect me to cure them last week. It was the most important thing probably that I experienced here was the real privilege of getting to know and learn from the people with the injuries. The other was that the project took a chance on me with absolutely no training in administration. It gave me the opportunity to take on this experience, to learn about media, to learn about speaking to the public, and to be able to oversee the support staff. And what an incredible set of career skills that was. It was a great staff. I'm still in contact with some of these people, and take advantage of all the opportunities Miami gives you. That's all I'll say. What did I learn at NINDS? It gave me an immediate broader perspective. The Neurology Institute at NIH is one of 27 centers and institutes, and it alone is responsible for about 600 different neurological disorders. And you're spinal cord injured. You're this little tiny disorder that in those days was 11,000 a year. Now maybe it's closer to 18 or 20,000. But how do you get the world's attention to your disorder when you're in that kind of a pond. So I learned about diverse funding and viewpoints. I also learned that you have to be really tactical and seize opportunities. And I'll talk about a couple of those. The other is I learned how insular spinal cord injury could be, and I brought that to NIH. In those days, there were all kinds of arguments, even here within the project, care or cure. Where should our money go? How can you do cure when people need help now? Well, we have to work together and we have to access the resources that are there. And part of what we didn't understand was all the regulatory and other agencies. And I did have exposure to that through the NIH. What did I learn briefly at the Nielsen Foundation? We've continued to learn about the broader philanthropic context, and I'll talk a little bit about that. We get to fund programs today. We don't just have to slam to our brakes when we get to the end of research. We actually, and I'll talk about some of the things we do, we're very mission and vision driven, which I'll talk about. And I still strategically work with the other agencies, not just the federal agencies. I'll talk a little bit about how we collaborate. And this is my other disclaimer, as I do serve on the programmatic panel for one of the Department of Defense programs in spinal cord injury. We work with Wings for Life, the Reeve Foundation, International Spinal Research Trust, but we also work with philanthropies that are not doing disability research. And one of those, a very important one, is a new endeavor the last couple of years called the President's Council. What does the Ford Foundation, over there on the left, I can't get this to work very well. What does the Ford Foundation care about spinal cord injury? What does the Doris Duke or Kresge Foundation? These are huge philanthropies. So they actually initiated the President's Council to really look, as we talk about inclusion of racial minorities and socioeconomic breadth and diversity, what about different abilities? So this is not specifically spinal cord injury, but the Nielsen Foundation was invited to join the President's Council. They actually give grants on disability awareness in philanthropies to be able to have us teach them that even in all of their non-disability philanthropy, they're still doing disability philanthropy, and inclusion is now becoming part of a larger conversation. The other larger conversation that's happening, hopefully in philanthropies around the world, and certainly at the Nielsen Project, comes from, this is a figure from a strategic plan of the Council on Foundations, which is a large group, umbrella group for philanthropies like ours, with the idea of advancing trust. All of you students who are, like I was, afraid to write that first NIH grant, it's because of that power dynamic. They've got the money, I've got to play the game to try and get my money so I can do my career. That is an incredibly destructive power dynamic. Philanthropically, we can start to do something about that. I can't change the NIH, VA, all the others, but we are talking about building trusting relationships and equity and working with our grantees as partners. And that's something I did as a program director, not in so many words and not in specific initiatives, but certainly in the way I dealt with all of my grantees. And it's something we're talking a lot about at the foundation as well. So just an introduction of the overview of the perspective I have, thinking about what you may not know about. So what is the Craig H. Nielsen Foundation? People say, well, what do you do? I mean, when I was still a cell biologist, they said, well, what do you do? My grandmother would say, well, she's a biochemist. You know, no, I'm not. You know, I'm with the Craig H. Nielsen Foundation. Well, what's that? Well, you know, it's the Mark Bonacani, Christopher Reeve thing, only it's a different foundation. So it's important to understand what we are and what we're not, but mostly I'm going to go through this because I want to talk to you about our values. So Craig was an incredible developer. He built recreational hotel, not recreational, you know, hotels that middle America could go to and have a really good time at. They happen to be associated with casinos. And he was a very demanding, very artistic developer. His properties were beautiful. In 1985, he was in a collision with a semi-truck and had a severe injury, not that different from Mark's. And never lost his drive. What his son Ray, who's on our board of directors, says is that's when he really kicked in. He looked around from his chair and he says, we're not doing enough. And he built his company up from where it had been one property to, you know, what it became. And he began to give personally And then through a foundation that he founded in 2020, in 2002. First grants given in 2003. And that's the legacy. What we have is the money that he left for the foundation. So we're fully endowed. We're not a fundraising foundation. I'm not telling news to some of you because some of you had an advantage I never had, which is having met him. He was honored at the Great Sports Legends dinner in 2006, and this was just a couple of months before he passed away. And since I was already at NIH, I didn't have the opportunity to meet him personally, but I work with people who did. What are those values of his that we have literally used daily in the foundation and use, as some of you who serve on our review committees know, every time we judge a grant? Leadership. We want to lead by example, but we want leaders within the community to work with us. Inclusion, excellence, collaboration, and creativity. And those are big words, and they can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. Inclusion can mean expanding opportunities, which is what we're doing, both opportunities for researchers and within the community for people living with spinal cord injury. Excellent gets back to that. It's all about the results. In research, they talk about transparency and rigor. Obviously, those are important. But what are the results? Collaboration in terms of leveraging knowledge. So some of the things I'm going to talk about today are just to let you know all the other things that are going on, hoping that you will use those to build from rather than repeat. And we used to say innovation, which is a term NIH uses. It's not really just about being new. It's about being creative. It's about taking us, finding the ways in to mole in where NIH won't go to help you get a leg up to bring something important to the other agencies. We fund US and Canadian organizations. We fund nonprofits in the community through, I'm going to tell you this mainly so you know the acronyms, Creating Opportunity and Independence funds charities in the community. We call it CONI. And you can see we have several areas of expertise, emphasis. Art, sports, and recreation is one, assistive tech, et cetera, et cetera. We fund education. Education how? Rehab docs who want to do their one-year residency certification in spinal cord injury, we will fund them. In fact, we fund most everyone in the country now that the VA doesn't already fund. The Neilsen Scholarship Program funds people with injuries who are doing their undergraduate and graduate work in selected universities. I'll go through each of these in a little bit more detail, again, just to give you the acronyms. Our two research portfolios, many of you know us because you've either been funded by us or is trying to be funded by us. Spinal cord injury research on the translational spectrum, SCIRTS. When I got to the Nielsen Foundation, it was 9 people. All of us happened to be female. And I thought, okay, SCIRTS. How do we make that work in an acronym? But it's important. It's research, yeah. It's on a translational spectrum. The first thing you say translation, everybody assumes you don't want to do basic science anymore. And that's not it. It's the whole spectrum. And it's a really important distinction. Psychosocial research is a newer portfolio. I'll go into the details of that. And we do some off portfolio grants as well. So since Craig started funding through the foundation to now, as of last year, we had funded over $250 million worth of research and programs, which is pretty phenomenal to be able to say. I'm not used to working with words that start with B like that. And that's over 2,200 grants. This is a big slide with a lot of acronyms. I'm going to go through it slowly. First, those programmatic grants. What are those? It's not just the CONI portfolio, but in the last 2 years, spent a heck of a lot of time on emergency relief and preparedness. We, like you, got totally freaked out when we were told, we'd literally just finished our, Dave and I were in Houston, we were doing our SCIRTS review, came home and said, oops, you can't leave your house. And I spent one weekend trying to figure out how to get groceries. And I thought, this is hard for me. What if I were sitting in a wheelchair? I mean, what in the world would I do? So within a week, we basically turned around our whole world and said, how do we get money out to real people? We use our partnerships. We build a collaboration. We go to those organizations in the community we've already been funding that are wondering what the heck they're going to do. And they've got the people they've been serving anyway. We went to our board and said, give us some authority we don't usually have. Give us a chunk of money. let our staff do this. And literally we were turning around grants in a 1 week, 1-page application, 1 week. If you can show us that you can get the PPE to people, that you can get the food, that you can get them to their doctors, we'll give you $10,000. And we got the most amazing results. I don't know if you can really see it, but this is rows and rows of toilet paper and water that went out within a week of coming to us. And so ultimately we gave away $2.8 million doing that. We went to United Spinal, which has national chapters, and said, what can you do? And they said, oh my God, we're reeling. We've had to cancel our fundraising. What are we going to do? We gave them some money, and then they gave away another $500,000 through their chapters in the same kind of relief. And then we told our researchers, look, don't worry about it. Keep your people in the lab. We know that you can't be there. And then once people started to go back in the lab, we said, look, you got 3 months worth of pay. What are you going to do? So we were one of the first organizations to provide research grant supplements to our grantees to help pay some of that back. So that's all fine. That's looking in the back. I've patted us on the back a little bit. I feel really good about being able to do that, but that is that creativity thing. That is us standing back and saying, oh my God, what are we going to do? We've got to do everything we do differently to ask everybody else to do things differently. We had already been funding United Spinal to develop emergency preparedness. Every once in a while, there'd be a huge wildfire or hurricane, and we'd throw some money at it at a local organization. We said, we got to do better. How do we get all of those relief efforts thinking about people with disabilities, particularly mobility disabilities? So they had a grant with us through CONI to develop emergency planning, but they knew all about disability and the spinal cord community, but not so much about recovery. Team Rubicon, which is developed by a group of veterans, knows all about recovery operations. They are there the day after the disaster hits, and they are pulling people out and doing amazing things. So we teamed them up. So they learned about disability things, and United Spinal is learning about recovery things. And I know that David is working here on hurricane preparedness, so you need to hook in with them as well. The second half of the emergency grants I talked about, we did it in 2 big tranches as we learned what was going on. And the second time we realized it wasn't just about getting groceries out, but people are doing things differently. People are starting to transition to a new way of working in the future, and that involved remote. Everything we're doing here, hybrid, this is the way of the future. So we made bigger grants to allow people, we had already been buying Zoom subscriptions, but we made grants to allow people to start to make that pivot in a much more direct way. And again, I don't pretend we're the only ones that did this. David was already publishing on this. Both Davids, David Gator, this is one of David Gator's on the ongoing use of remote in rehab. I know that David was already, in his first few days in the job, was going out and speaking to the community. We need more of this. We need to think about it. We need to learn what other people are doing. And that's all good. That was all good news. That's not pointing fingers at anybody. Moving quickly through our education programs. So those are the 2 that I've got circled here, back to spinal cord injury medicine fellowships. For those who don't know, who were in the labs like I was, I had no idea what ACGME meant. But if you want to be certified as a spinal cord doc, you have to be in a program that is certified to teach you that. And so there's a limited number of those in the country. Some of them are funded by VA. As I said, we fund pretty much all the rest of them at this point. We originally started out funding through our CRNI portfolio when 1 or 2 of them would say, hey, look, we got a fellow, can you give us $100,000? Or in those days, probably $60,000. So we developed it into an actual program. And in 2001, thanks to David Gator, Miami is back in that, and hopefully we'll fund a couple of the fellows this coming year. Neilsen Scholarship Program is something we stood up. It's really a weird program to do, but it's saying, look, you guys are in wheelchairs. You're trying to live your life, build your life again. How do you go back to school? Okay, tuition and fee, that's one thing. That's what a lot of scholarships do. But what we actually fund is supplemental support fund. It's more expensive to get housing that's accessible. It's more expensive to have to get food. You can't necessarily, depending on the person's level of injury, you may need to buy. One of the first grants we gave, we bought the whole computer system that a high tetra, a person with high tetraplegia needed to go to a community college. I'm really, really proud of this program. We have supported 209 students since we figured out how to do this in 2014. 106 have already graduated. Some of them are doing amazing things. I was going to show you the video from our website, but I don't really have time. But Mackenzie Solden is there talking about it. Not only did she do her 4 years of college under one of these scholarships, she got an extra year and happened to get a gold medal in Paralympic basketball. She's also now a sort of ambassador to the community for all things spinal cord injury and sports related. So she's doing great things with her life as well. And there's going to be many more of those stories. On the research end, you're most familiar with this. I don't need to tell you a lot, the SCIRTS program to understand treatments and things. But again, I'll underline this last line. The one feeble vision that I brought to the Nielsen Foundation was knowing that we didn't want to replace NIH funding. We wanted to enhance NIH funding. So we tend to fund enabling studies, get new people into the field, bring people in from other fields, help people make a pivot in their work so that they can get, I want them to then get the R01s. Newsflash, starting last year, we upped the levels in both of our research programs by about 30% across the grant portfolios. So for instance, the fellowships used to be 150,000 over 2 years, which is still higher than most NIH fellowships are. But taking inflation into mind and all the other things that are coming up and data sharing and all the other things that have happened since this portfolio stood up, we felt it was time to boost these grants. Similarly, psychosocial research portfolio, it's a newer area. What is psychosocial research? First people thought, oh, it's because people get depressed after their injuries. That is not it. It's how the person's well-being and the opportunities in their environments and communities allow them to live their full lives that they want, which is, essentially our vision. So it's that interrelationship between the behavioral things that they do with the programs they're keeping themselves well in, their psychological profiles, the support systems, their caregiver systems. A lot of it is qualitative research, going out and exploring the problems within the community, and there's not enough of it going on. As I'll show you in a minute, there's only one of the federal agencies funds a lot in this area, and we need more of it. So those of you who are thinking that that might be an interest, I really want you to think about this portfolio. And all of this stuff's on the website, so I won't spend a lot of time talking about the details of the grants. But again, they're 2- and 3-year grants and postdoctoral fellowships. So I want to talk about some of these collaborative efforts between the agencies. More acronyms. The Department of Defense funds through the CDMRP, which is congressionally demanded or mediated programs. I can't pretend to remember all their acronyms, but they have a spinal cord injury research program, which has been doing great work for the last 10 or 14 years. Obviously the NIH, the VA, both through their rehab, but also in their basic programs, and the Nielsen Foundation. And because I am on the program committee for SCIRP and certainly knew the people at NIH, we got together and said, how do we figure out, each of us has a different mission. Each of us has to answer to Congress or the department secretaries or the board of directors. How do we say we're not just overlapping each other? How do we know what we're doing? Oh, well, I'm doing stem cell. What does that mean? Does that mean you're doing stem cells for movement or stem cells for pain or, okay, so we needed a better system, and DoD really cares about stage and readiness. And we developed this coding system I'm going to walk you through really quickly. Now, this is a snapshot. All the active grants at the end of last year, we report to each other. I'm not giving you numbers, I'm giving you proportions. Stage and readiness gets back to that spectrum idea. What did I mean when I said research spectrum? It starts at very basic research. What are the cells in the brain? How do they work in a normal spinal cord? All the way up to phase 3 definitive trials. This is ready to be labeled as a new treatment for a person. And the way we've broken it down for the purposes of this, and I can't make it work, starting on the left, basic is sort of normal spinal cord. If you're not actually looking at injury, in this case, disease-related basic may be human or animal studies, because you may be determining those psychosocial issues for a person with spinal cord injury, but it's mostly animal work. Translational, which is the yellow, and I want to bring your attention to the fact that we all do a lot of translational research. By definition, for this purpose, is all preclinical. The last three columns of the green, the blue, and the dark blue are clinical research. So let's just parse this a little bit. We all do at least a third. Well, VA right now on this particular day had only about a quarter of their portfolio in translational, which is you have an intervention, you're using it in animals to test it. We all do a fair amount of disease-related basic. NIH does an awful lot of disease-related basic. So they're still fundamental in orientation. DoD does very little of that. They want people in the military to get better on the field, maybe go back and not yet become veterans. We tend to be pretty standard and coordinated. One thing I'll say about Nielsen Funding, you don't see any dark red. We don't do basic normal spinal cord. We don't do clinical trials. We're not big enough. But who does high-end clinical trials? VA does phase 3 trials in VA labs. And a lot of you have VA associations here. Even SCRP will do a few phase 3 trials. Look at how much clinical research, more than half of SCRP funding is clinical. Almost half of Nielsen Foundation funding is clinical, again, because the psychosocial research is all clinical. NIH does very little in clinical. We can't seem to break through the review at NIH to get very much clinical funding done. We want more of that. Again, that's my mission as an advocate here today. And VA is sort of in the middle. I'm surprised that was just an off day for them because I think they do more clinical than that. It's not advancing. I'm frozen here, Iggy. The next one I'm going to talk about is the system problem grants. And this is a complex thing, but what is it we're trying to study? And let me tell you the layout. I'm looking at how many grants on December NIH had in an area. In blue, it's what the DoD was funding. In gray is the VA and then the Nielsen Foundation. Now this is number of grants. Remember, our grants are smaller. For years, I've been hearing the spinal cord community say, the only thing anybody looks at is walking. All you scientists only care about walking. Health effects, these are secondary health effects. This is autonomic, cardiovascular, all the things that are not motor or sensory or neuropathology and basic regeneration. And that is a very, very big category. So that myth needs to die. We do care about what's happening to real people. It's the beginning of where we all want to go. And these should all be communicating with each other. But those are the big three areas: motor, neuropathology, that includes neuroprotection, and health-related effects. And we're all in those spaces, although not equally so. Acute management, that's a special area of Department of Defense. They have to deal with soldiers in field getting injured. And they have a particular mission in that area more than the rest of us. Look at sociological, which is where not all, but a lot of the psychosocial falls. It's really us and DoD. We have not made inroads, even though it's part of the NIH's National Center for Medical Rehab Research. That is part of their research plan and has been for more than the last 5 years, and they still don't fund in that area. Normal spinal cord, again, is more NIH than anybody else. This is funding, and I know everybody says, well, it really comes down to dollars. So I'll just make 2 points. I'm not trying to say the Nielsen Foundation is as big as the NIH. It's not my purpose here. Again, it's really the proportionality that I'm trying to talk about. Because our grants are smaller, if you do it by dollars, we get to be much less. But as you see, we try to be across the board. We don't try to say we're only going to target something immediately ready for people. We're willing to do the more basic things. The other thing you need to hear is that NIH only reports out, it's starting to freeze again. NIH only reports out 1 year at a time. So these orange, you have to multiply them by 4 on average. So NIH would take me off the slides. So that's one of the reasons I'm not talking too much about dollars. Okay, third side, approach intervention. So again, just because you're studying one of those areas, who's in the stem cell space, who's in the devices space, who's in the drug space. And here you see it's really kind of interesting. I wasn't aware, but NIH is pretty heavy in the devices space. So those of you who want to be there, where else is NIH? Discovery. Look at how much that stands out. So if you're on the basic end of things, you're ready for R01s. If your work is good enough, if you got your preliminary data, NIH is ready for you. We hope to build them up in some of these other areas. These others you can see, like, let's just take stem cells, pretty evenly. Everybody's there, not necessarily meaning we're overlapping, but there are places where, you can see some specialties. And when it comes to resources and things, that's, for instance, where we would put our spinal cord injury medicine fellows and other things. So we may count more grants in that areas than others, because we also do postdoc training, but that would end up here in the subject matter areas. So just to give you, the one thing, so again, and Nielsen Foundation's across the board, but we're not here in assistive technology. Why is that? We don't develop the devices so much, but we fund a lot in our programmatic portfolios to get the devices that are out there to people. So that's the reason that we fall down in that area a little bit. Again, all of this is meant to be inclusive, not exclusive. I was thrilled when Alan Mundy joined DARPA and told us that he really wanted to develop something in DARPA that would focus on spinal cord injury. They had been doing brain-computer interfaces with haptics and things under Doug Weber, but this is really about spinal cord injury. And look at these dollars. They developed a huge grant through Davis, but actually through Vancouver and San Diego on some brain-computer interface and stem cell work, $36 million, bowel and bladder work, again, device-oriented at Pittsburgh, and CSF management they made a grant to Johns Hopkins, and you can look these up on the website. This is actually their website. That's huge. Department of Defense pouring $50 million into spinal cord injury all at once. It's amazing. Those things are always out there. Giving credit again to our Canadian colleagues. I don't actually know that much about mendthegap, but they're very, very interested in not only doing the research, but getting it all the way through to clinical, to commercialization. And so they've just also invested $26 million through their New Frontiers Research Fund. So there is a lot going on in the world to try and make translation work, which I think is just the best possible news. The other thing that we develop besides just funding is resources that are out there. And I want to use this for a moment to give you a couple of scenarios about how does spinal cord injury get our toe in the door? And maybe not just the toe, because then it gets stubbed, but actually maybe the beginning of our boot, our toes. Here's an example, common data elements. I was still at NINDS. This was back in, I think, 2008. Why do we need common data elements for clinical research? Okay. NIH wanted people to share their data from clinical studies. Okay, you have a data set, you share it. You're done, right? Let's just take one piece of data. What's your gender or sex? Well, even that was controversial because in Europe they use one term, here we use sex, and there I forget which one is which. But some people may say male and female. Somebody else may do M and F. Somebody else may now recognize multiple genders, or they may code it as a 1 and a 2. How do you combine those data sets? And then you multiply that by all the data that we collect in our research studies. So the common data elements are not the things that everybody needs to collect all of them in their studies. It's the structure by which data can be collected so that we can share them and do meta-analyses on this. What a great idea. Okay, I'm new. I'm basically doing cell biology. Joanne Odenkirchen in the clinical division at that point office in NINDS says, okay, we're going to do this. We've got a contract. We've set aside the money. It's hard to do that. And there's 600 disorders. We're going to start. We're going to do stroke. It's NINDS. The S stands for stroke. Duh. We're going to do Parkinson's. Of course. We're going to do epilepsy. Of course. Oh, stroke. Well, we're going to do TBI. So I've started out the 5 or 6 things that she identified that first day. Oh, we need a few of those smaller things. Let's do multiple sclerosis. That's a good one. They advocate a lot. Or muscular dystrophy. Yeah, there's some loud voices there too. And I'm sitting in the audience going, in 2002, I was in Vancouver at a meeting and the clinicians all got together to develop these things called international data sets. Now, these were not research data sets. They were clinical data sets, but we could do research on those if we were all sharing them, right? And I went to Joanne and I said, how come this is the first I'm hearing about this? When do we get to the table? And she goes, oh, well, spinal cord injury is kind of small and we'll get there. And I go, well, what do I tell this guy who's got international data sets that he's been developing for the last 5 years? And she said, you've got what? And I said, we've got international data sets that the clinicians have agreed on, and we want to build them into research data sets. Spinal cord injury was the first disorder to post data sets on this website. And they've since gone through the whole process of developing codes for FIM and SCIM and all the standard things. And one of the other things that came out of this once we got into it is we didn't really have a good way to talk about imaging data, because imaging the spinal cord is very different than imaging in the brain. So we had one of the groups develop whole new data sets for DTI and MRI imaging, and another for electrophysiological measures. So it's not, this has been just a hugely productive thing, that because we were able to get our foot in the door, we were able to play with the big boys and really get a lot done a lot faster than you might have thought. And for those of you who are doing rehab research here or rehab clinical work, you need to realize that just this year they published finally the neuro rehab data, CDE data sets. This is a collaboration. It's still on the NINDS site. There's a collaboration with the National Center for Medical Rehab Research, and I'm sure they work with NIDLR on a lot of this as well. So that's a new thing out there that you will be expected to use. The other resource that's out there, I have nothing to do with. It was largely funded through Rick Hansen, but Canadians are very much more into implementation of the research than Americans have ever been. And I think we all need to learn from them. But they've developed this incredible database, which is just huge, called Skyr, which is about research evidence, which is trying to make available to rehab docs what evidence is available for the best rehab processes. And it's a huge website, and it's more than I could possibly digest. But if you're in the research world, in the rehab research world, I hope you know about it and use it. The other data sharing effort that I've been involved with, and again, foot in the door kind of thing, was when Adam Ferguson was still a postdoc at Ohio State with Jackie Bresnahan and Mike Beatty. He wanted to take big data approaches. He was also doing TNF alpha work, and he was a real scientist, but he just was really interested in big data and wanted to go back. He actually went back with some of his colleagues and did a look back at the original paper data sets that were stored in a garage in New Jersey from something called MASCUS that was run when I was still back, when I first came to the Miami project. It was the multi-center animal spinal cord injury trial that was running alongside the big methylprednisolone clinical trials of the day. And it was through that effort that the BB scale was first originated, that the very first contusion injury, the NYU model, was originated through MASCUS. And he went back and digitized all that data and figured out that the one thing nobody saw in the control groups was the big thing that varied in relation to neurological outcomes in the control groups was blood pressure control. And if you go back and you look at, Adams just published a really impressive paper on the fact it's not just minimum blood pressure, but there's a maximum. There's a sweet zone of blood pressure control after injury that we now need to be paying attention to. That all came out of this big data. Cool, I told you I wasn't going to talk about science. Why am I talking about this? Because I was his program director for this was his, not his first, his second R01. And he was building up all this stuff, and he outgrew the computer power that he had. But he had built this incredible database. I fought for 3 years at NIH trying to get him the money to get the infrastructure he needed to actually make this into a resource for the community. And we just couldn't do it. I tried to supplement him. Okay. When I got to the Nielsen Foundation, I said, look, we've got to do something. So we funded a 3-year grant to him that allowed Adam to connect up with the neuroscience information, NIF, whatever that's, framework, thank you, to actually build a database with the best, with the experts from the National Library of Medicine and the people in San Diego that he works with. That 3-year grant got him tremendously. We became a poster child on the NIF posters at the neuroscience meeting, Vision SCI, great, getting our foot in the door. We still weren't there at the end of 3 years. So what we did was we partnered with Wings for Life and International Spinal Research Trust. Right now, we're just funding 5 years of they've got this whole curation thing. Kareem Fuad at University of Alberta is now co-leading this and actually has the grant at University of Alberta to really bring this forward and to have the community. guess what? Within a year, you're going to have to share your animal data that NIH pays for. This is where you should be sharing it. And because there's going to be this big rush, again, it's not responding. Iggy, I need your help. Can you go forward for me when I ask, please? This week, you still have 3 days left. The Spinal Research Trust didn't have the funds to kick in with us when we funded this grant, but what they did do is they're funding a bounty. So they want as many people as possible to submit data sets this week. And the first ones that are in good shape and go through curation are going to get a bonus, are going to get a prize from Spinal Research. So if you got data sets ready, go for it. So those are examples, getting my foot in the door, what kind of resources I hope that you all know about. And if you don't, you should learn more about them. Another resource that Miami has always had is people with spinal cord injury right here interested in your research. For a long time, that was enough, but the community is speaking out more and more and more, and has been very vocal at NIH meetings and other places. So there are resources for that as well. And I want you to, I know that David has been pressing this, but those of you who are sitting in the labs doing your work with cells, it's as important for you as it is for the people who've now moved over to the new hospital. It should be something all people with spinal cord injury research in mind should be doing and thinking about. What do people care about? They still care about restoring bowel and bladder. If they're going to put a device in them, how much function did they want back to call it enough? That needs to inform FDA. That needs to inform Medicare. What's enough? What do people want? And guess what? They want it now. And they don't want to keep hearing about cures in the news that they don't have access to. This was from a survey that was presented at SCI 2020. Again, the Canadians are way ahead of us. They've been developing the integrated knowledge translation. Again, I know David's talked to you about this. If you don't know their work, look up their website. The other organization, and this is one that the Nielsen Foundation has been, again, doing some infrastructure funding for, is the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium. So they're actually training people in the community with spinal cord injury how to work with researchers at different phases of the work, whether it's early on in review. I mean, if you go to SCIR, there are going to be people with spinal cord injury at peer review and at the programmatic level. Well, people have to learn how to do that. You can't throw a person with no research training into a room full of research docs. Of course, they do it anyway because the military are often there also. So there's a lot of expertise that go into listening on those review committees. I know you know about this because at the SCI summit last month, Jen French was a speaker, so I assume she talked to you about NASIC, but this is an incredible resource for those of you who want to learn how to respectfully and without tokenism invite people into your research world and work with them. And this was, again, the gift the Miami Project gave me as scientific liaison, was having to do this all day and professionally. I'm going to end up here with the last few minutes on terms of planning and getting to planning. What happened when I went to NIH and learned all the things they didn't know about spinal cord injury was about how much the spinal cord injury community was interested in collaborating with each other and thinking about things and build centers like the Miami Project. And by then ICORD had stood up in Vancouver and the Reeve Irvine Center. So as Dalton won't know as well, because he was there, I had a meeting in 2003, getting the center directors together with a few other key people to say, how do we get each one not saying, I'm the biggest, I'm a fundraising competitor, but to actually work together. Do you know over here at Irvine that there's somebody doing research in Miami that's very similar to yours? Are you talking to each other? One of the big take homes from this was the basic scientists learned how much stuff was starting to go on clinically in Portugal with olfactory and sheathing cells, and over here and in all kinds of country, and in the United States, there was shark embryos. And there was like, we really need to be a better voice about this. We need to be able to talk to people who might be considering participating in these wacky treatments or these trials. So there was a long series of international meetings. Jim Guest and I were both involved in many of them. and guidance about how trials should be run, and to help educate the community as much about what wasn't a trial. But one of the things that came out of that was a booklet aimed at people who might be considering participating, what you should know if you're considering being in a trial. And I want you all to know that we've just, one of the people at Wings for Life and I last year spent a tremendous amount of time doing a second update on this, really talking about what a trial is, what it isn't, what people, help people understand the language they'll hear if they're considering participating in a trial. And one of the better things in it is that there's questions they should ask, and not just questions, but answers they should get. So the one question is, will this trial put you at risk? The obvious person thinks, thank you, I don't want risk. Well, if somebody's telling you there's no risk, don't go in their trial. I mean, that's just not the way trials work. So one of the things I noticed is Miami site needs to update their link to this new version. One of the other things that came out was the lists of clinical trials that Dan Lammertz was keeping, did a tremendous amount of work over the updating quarterly what was in clinicaltrials.gov to make that so that at least the research community knew which trials were going on. That turned into the SCI Trials Finder site. And I bring this up for two reasons. One is that this site's here, and it's an entry point for people with spinal cord injury to learn about trials for you to potentially recruit through. But it's also an example of where things went haywire and didn't work as well as we wish they would have. It actually began, we were trying to collaborate with the people at NASIC. They wanted to continue doing the curated trials that are interventional and the kinds of things that they had been looking at all those years. People with spinal cord injury said, we don't care about curation. We want to be able to talk about all the trials. And somehow the communication broke down and they just couldn't come to an agreement. So basically there are now two sites that, if you look at it, are actually structured fairly similarly because they began at one, but they have very different backgrounds in what's in the sites. So those of you who are talking to people in the public or using them, just realize there are two sites and there are some differences between them. Planning efforts, and I'll end up here. I've got just about enough time. Every time I talk to a new foundation or somebody that wants to come in, and I'm sure that those of you who are talking to donors, when Spinal Research and the Re Foundation changed their leadership recently, it's like, we need a plan. We need that perfect translational plan, and we're going to get very decisive about the direction we're going. And I'm going, okay, we really need another plan. Been there, done that. I'm starting to feel very, very old. We did the planning in 2003, 2004. New York State had you get a ticket, some of the money goes to spinal cord injury research thing going. And they commissioned the Institute of Medicine, which is Congress's arm for research, to do a study of spinal cord injury. It's a beautiful book. And Mary Bungie was actually on this committee. And they basically came up with the same stuff that we had done through the workshops. But we need more regeneration. We need to understand pathology. And by the way, funders are all messed up if you read the recommendations. But mostly New York was more messed up. Honestly, it was a great effort. It was a wonderful resource to have to be able to point to. But okay, then NIDR did one in 2000 and whatever that is. I don't have my glasses on. 2010, they did State of the Science. Then ISCOS, International Spinal Cord Society, and got together with WHO in 2013. And then there was one in Australia. I was actually invited to Australia for one day. I said, thank you very much. I don't think I'll go. And then when Lynn Jakeman took the position at NIH that I had left, she said, look, it's been 15 years since we did this. NINDS needs to focus on spinal cord injury again, or actually NIH. And they did the SCI 2020 meeting. But when you look at the recommendations, I kind of defy you to find differences. We still need regeneration. We still need to understand the processes. We still need to understand the pathophysiology, and we still need to get things to people. How do we do that planning better? So I don't want another field-wide planning effort. Rick Hansen Institute did a very focused meeting in 2016, which really did have some outcomes. Now they've changed their name now to Praxis, but that was also the name of this meeting. And they were very focused on the translational values. But one of the things they did was they forced us to sit in assigned seats at tables where there was a clinician and a researcher and a person with spinal cord injury and a funder or a regulator. And all the discussions required those groups to come to consensuses. And they really came up with some pretty broad ideas. It was incredibly depressing. The one thing they didn't have as a solution to any of these valleys of death. And the regeneration panel I was on was one of the most depressing one there was. But what did come out of it was NASIC. This is how NASIC was born. That consumer group decided to get together and say, we're really going to do this. This was a great way to have discussions, and we need more of this. And we're going to provide the resources of people with spinal cord injury that can participate and have more of these. The research community got together, and this was not something the Nielsen Foundation did, although we were there. It was RE Foundation, Wings for Life, and a Swiss foundation, and ISRT developed a new international planning committee and some of the data sharing efforts. So there was a group that published 5 papers just before the pandemic started, again, looking at clinical trials. What are the stopping points? What do we need to do differently? Recruitment is a stopping point, getting into more adaptive designs and trials, developing biomarkers, both imaging and neurochemical and electrophysiological. So that's what the researchers did. And the other thing that came out of this was that those websites of getting clinical trial information out to the area. Nielsen Foundation's taken a slightly different approach to either fund people who want to do a focused working group, or and these are an upper and lower extremity. We partnered with this organization called Scope. Gordon Mitchell came to us and said, look, I want to get a meeting on acute intermittent hypoxia. And I said, you know what? I keep getting applications for basic mechanisms in acute, and I keep getting clinical trials. So if we're at the stage of doing clinical trials, what basic and how are you talking to each other? So I challenged him to develop a translational roadmap, and he did an incredible conference in 2016 and developed a roadmap that went all the way to who's going to build the devices once this gets to be an approved treatment. And this is actually a fairly recent paper I've got here, 2021. He's following that roadmap. He's had continuing meetings. He's trying to keep this group together in a very targeted way to get all these different groups talking to each other. The one workshop we put together was bowel and bladder function, which we held in 2017. And this was the overall review that we wrote from it. I did a search. This is PubMed. They were actually both bowel and bladder, but I searched for bladder. That's why it's. So what came out of that? The first thing that happened, we said, you know, the lowest hanging fruit is PVA hasn't updated the bowel clinical practice guidelines in over 20 years. What will it take to get you to prioritize those? And they go, well, we've already picked our 3 things for the year. So what if we give you the money to do it? Oh yeah, we can do a 4th one. We've got the manpower to do it. So we got that going. It was published last year. We did an RFA. The first call for proposals in an area outside portfolios, because we just found that they weren't reviewing well enough. It's not that people didn't want to study bowel and bladder, but they weren't being prioritized in review enough. And we didn't want to own this. We didn't take it on from there. We asked the field to develop working groups, and that has continued. There was a working group saying, look, if you're doing clinical research, how do we get you to add in some bladder measures so that we don't lose that opportunity in a larger clinical trial? The trial is not about bladder, but you can still be doing that if you get some easy ways. What are the best easy ways to get in there? And if you want to do a good bladder study, there's a lot of information about that. And then I served on a committee also doing that. Greg Holmes and Charles Hubscher did one on preclinical. And certainly for that, with all the animals that we've got living with spinal cord injuries, why aren't we quantifying the bladder information out of that and using that, even if it's not a bladder study? The last working group, and this is, I think, on my last slide, one of my last slides, is neuromodulation. And they were really interested in looking at electrical, but also chemical neuromodulation. And they started out saying, we need to talk to people with spinal cord injuries. So they actually contracted with NASIC, and were one of the projects NASIC selected to do a survey of what people are looking for in bladder management. And then they built their own roadmap on advancing neuromodulation in that, which was published last year. So That's a lot of roadmaps. Okay. Which map should I be following? What route am I here to tell you? And the answer is, I don't know what to tell you. There is no one route. There are lots of promising routes. I'm not trying to argue because we looked at Bladder, that's where you should all be doing your research. We have to follow all those. Remember, I showed you we were funding in all those different areas. So we are willing to fund many different routes, but we can't just keep iterating. We do have to look in our rear view mirror, which is why I selected this picture. But we have to get beyond just doing the same thing over and over again. Iggy, help me out here. Iggy. Thank you. Thank you. Success will require dedication to actually taking that translational road. I know that those of you like I were basic scientists, that's what you do well, but you do eventually have to either get on the road or hand off. We have to commit our resources strategically. Sometimes we have to recognize that we've gone down a dead end and it's time to stop. Treatments can only get so complex. We have to move forward safely and cooperatively because there's a lot of people on the road and they're not all going the same directions we are. But that's where all this collaboration and the shared resources and learning the shortcuts other people have already found will pay off. And we need to hand off to other drivers because none of us can do it all the way through. Even the project alone can't do it all the way through. You may or may not have all the clinical and the commercial expertise you need. And we need to get real about what we can do well and when it's time to hand off and take that handoff as part of our responsibility. So last but not least, my thanks to Maria for organizing this, Mark for inviting me. I know what goes into coordinating this series because I used to run it. And these were now I didn't do all of these posters, but these are mostly the posters from what was once the night series of lectures. So it is an incredible honor for me to be here today, to be part of that. It's something I never expected. And I thank you very much. I don't know if you want to do any questions. I'm going to meet with people. We're right at the hour, but people can get up and leave if you need to. Some people I know already did. They told me before, but if you want to ask questions, I'm willing to answer. Wait. If you're gonna say nice things about me, you have to wait till everybody in the world can hear it.
Okay, I may not ask a question, but I just wanted to thank you for being here. Your historical perspective of the spinal cord world is very important. A lot of people that haven't experienced it for all these years, and your contributions in terms of so many areas, NIH, the Nielsen Foundation, wow, and what you did in my project when I joined. Really appreciate all your efforts, and it's really great to see so many different types of activities associated with spinal cord research. I mean, it's unlimited in terms of what you can do if you're interested in the biology, the translational aspect, and the clinical trials. So thank you very much and I look forward to talking to you later.
Well, thank you very much. That's embarrassing. Hi, Jay.
Naomi, thanks for that presentation. Since you brought up roadmaps, I had a couple of questions. One, both kind of based on my observations. That in any of the roadmap, at least in my personal experience that I've seen, a missing voice has been really the industry. And they're going to play a crucial role in bringing anything to patients and people with spinal cord injury. It's a little better with devices in the devices field, but in the therapeutics field, it's really lacking. And so when I've been talking to them, one thing is that there's really no infrastructure in our field for any industry to kind of jump in and test new therapeutics. And so my first question is, is the Nielsen Foundation planning on doing something about the lack of infrastructure in our field? And two is, even if there is then they're kind of forced to really just collaborate with individual laboratories, each of whom have different definitions of what go, no-go decisions are in terms of whether a therapeutic is worth pursuing.
So I'm going to both agree with you and disagree with you. Yes, that is an absolute gap. No, it's not absent. So perfect example is what Gordon did with acute intermittent hypoxia. Now it falls in the devices side of things, but I wasn't expecting it. But he went far enough in that workshop to go all the way to what it will take to build a commercial device to do this. So some people do take it to that extent. The other is that there have been some NIH level. There are certain things that are just too big for the Nielsen Foundation to do. So that's the other place in terms of just because I've pointed it out doesn't mean it's something we will do. But NIH has done experiments again in the devices field to bring to develop the IP ways for the Boston Science and Medtronic and the others to be able to work with researchers that are building some of those solutions. And then you run into the problem again of, well, it's just spinal cord injury. Who cares about that? But look what's happened with epidural stimulation, because it was interesting enough for Medtronic and Boston Science to get involved. That's another place I think there's been a gap. Epilepsy had that at NINDS, even when I was there, that was already starting to develop some of that and had a lot of pharma interest in it. I think with regenerative therapies, it's not as clear what the companies are, and the drug companies out there are all sort of wounded by all of the negatives that have happened. There are a few that are willing to do. I mean, obviously there's the NOGO receptor trial going on and the others, but those tend to be small startup companies. And they are one-off efforts, as you said. The NOGO receptor trial, it was almost all NIH funded as Stephen Strittmatter developed it, and even developed the company that's through several generations later doing the testing. But that's kind of where big pharma is these days. Let somebody else take those risks. Let the small company do the first test. And if it works out, we'll buy them out and we'll turn it into $1 billion thing. I don't know that that's something we as an individual field are going to fix, but I absolutely think that's someplace we need to advocate to, starting with NIH, better solutions. That's one of the reasons I wanted you to see how much work is going on through the DoD funding. Now, it's not as much, it's about 40 million a year, I think, that they've been doing. But they're much more in that translational readiness space to do those first clinical trials. They will be able to fund companies. We, because of the way our trust is written, can't actually fund commercial. We have to only fund nonprofits because of the way we're structured. But some of these other organizations are absolutely willing, interested, and happy to fund these kinds of collaborations. But there's not one structure for it. And it certainly could be something that we could be advocating NIH to do more of. NCATS is there. That's what they're supposed to do. They had, just mentioning to Vance and a previous thing, the bridges, they have things that are meant to do the pharmacology and the toxicology and to help out. And we've been able to get a few spinal cord studies in through that. And I know Miami just got one to help out with what John and Vance and Ahmad have been doing. That's the best answer. It is still a problem. It's not a nothing, but it's something we need more of. Any of the students on your trajectories or? Well, thank you. Okay.
I am not in the field of spinal cord injury. I'm more in the field of addiction, but I was just curious about how to get to where you are within other fields outside of spinal cord injury.
Yeah, I once actually gave a talk called Brainless Neuroscience because I've never actually worked in the brain. Like I say, I lucked into where I am in a sense because Miami had a need. It was literally Susan had left. Miami needed a spokesperson, and Dick and Mary and I sat up one Friday night. I came back Monday morning. I said, Dick, I think I know who could do that. And he said, who? And I said, me. And he said, absolutely not. No, he wanted me to stay in the lab, and I could have stayed in the lab, but that was my heart was I could do more in this space than I was doing as another person in the lab. So it starts with that kind of commitment and personal dedication to it. You can get into NIH through a number of ways, presidential fellows. I mean, there are program analyst jobs at neurology that I don't know what the alcohol, the AA and AAA do, But, the entry-level jobs get you, up to program director eventually, if that's where you want to go. The Nielsen Foundation is a phenomenal opportunity. They don't come along often, which is one of the reasons I left NIH to do it. But we also have program directors. So one of our SCIRT's program directors was 2 years out of his postdoc when we hired him. All the stuff I told you we do, our entire staff is 12 people. There's me and our executive director and 5 program officers, and then our grants and our finance people. It's not like there's a lot of those opportunities here. There's a lot of opportunities of talking to people that some of the foundations like the Reeve Foundation and others. I don't know what the alcohol, what the abuse, but there's a lot of foundations out there doing work in that area. And, looking into some of those, they always need people who are really dedicated to their mission.
Thank you.
Our
Thank
Zoom listeners, you can just unmute and ask any questions.
Oh, yeah, I forgot. All you people out there in the Netherlands. Yeah, she told me she would be. I hope I did okay, Mary. Okay, well, no additional questions. Thank you all for your time. Thank you for coming in person and online. Thank you very much.